"You think you have authority here?" The cop sneered, his grip tightening around Camille's wrist. She didn't flinch. Then a gun pointed at her face. The night air froze. Would this be just another unjust traffic stop turned deadly? Or would justice finally fight back? What happens when the wrong person gets pulled over, someone who knows the law better than the ones abusing it? Watch till the end and don't forget to like and subscribe. The Texas night stretched out endlessly before Camille Dawson, the rhythmic hum of her Cadillac Escalade's engine blending with the occasional rush of passing cars. The streetlights flickered along Interstate 45, casting golden streaks across the glossy black paint of her SUV. She'd been driving for about an hour, heading home after an exhausting security briefing, another long night in a job that demanded everything from her. Her thoughts drifted back to the classified discussion she had left behind. National security threats, operational challenges, bureaucratic nightmares. It was all part of the package of being the director of the FBI. Camille had handled countless high-stakes situations, but nothing in that briefing prepared her for what was about to happen. Red and blue lights suddenly erupted in her rearview mirror. Her heartbeat didn't spike. She wasn't the type to panic, but a cold sense of awareness settled in her chest. Instinct took over, her mind swiftly running through the checklist. Speed, exactly 65 mph. Lane discipline, perfect. Erratic movement, none. There was no reason for a traffic stop. Yet the patrol car didn't budge, its lights flashing insistently behind her. "All right, let's see what this is about." Camille flicked on her turn signal, slowly steering toward the shoulder. She'd worked with law enforcement her entire career. She knew protocols like the back of her hand. Hands on the wheel. No sudden movements. Stay calm. Still, something felt off. As the patrol car rolled to a stop, she adjusted her rearview mirror, trying to get a glimpse of the officer inside. No familiar faces, just a silhouette sitting there too long before finally moving. Then the driver's side door swung open. The man who stepped out wasn't just walking, he was stalking. A heavy, aggressive stride, as if he had already decided she was a problem. Officer Luke Reynolds. She didn't recognize him, but she recognized his type. The way his left hand hovered too close to his firearm, the way his flashlight swung back and forth like a weapon, the way he chewed his gum slowly, deliberately, eyes narrowed on her. Power play. Camille lowered her window, keeping both hands where he could see them. "Evening, officer." His flashlight didn't move. He aimed it straight at her face, the harsh glare forcing her to squint. Too long, too intrusive. License and registration. No greeting, no reason for the stop, just commands. Camille didn't react immediately. Years of experience taught her that silence unsettled men like him. She had dealt with terrorists, cartel leaders, corrupt politicians, people who thrived on intimidation and dominance. This was nothing new. Slowly, she reached for her purse on the passenger seat, narrating her actions aloud. "I'm reaching for my wallet now." No response. Camille retrieved her driver's license and FBI credentials, extending them toward him with measured patience. Reynolds didn't take them. He barely glanced at them, his jaw tightening before letting out a short, dismissive scoff. "FBI, huh?" He lingered on the words as if tasting them, as if they meant nothing to him. Camille nodded once, her expression unreadable. "Yes, sir." A beat of silence. Then, "Step out of the vehicle." The words were quiet, too quiet. They landed with an unnatural weight, like a test. Camille blinked. "Excuse me." Reynolds took a step back, giving himself space to reach, space to act. His right hand inched closer to his holster. "Step out." The air in the car thickened, pressing against her ribs. This was wrong. This was not protocol. She had followed every procedure correctly. She had identified herself. She had given him zero reason to escalate. Yet here he was. Camille had read reports like this before, watched the footage, seen the headlines. She knew how quickly situations like this could spiral. A normal person, a civilian, might have panicked, might have argued, might have reached for something too fast and ended up a statistic. But Camille wasn't a civilian. She was trained. She was calculated. She was prepared. Keeping her hands on the wheel, she met Reynolds' gaze through the blinding beam of his flashlight. "On what grounds, officer?" Reynolds' jaw twitched. He hadn't expected pushback. A flicker of irritation crossed his face before he masked it behind a smirk. "I don't have to explain myself to you." Ah, there it was. The control, the power trip, the twist of authority into something else entirely. Camille kept her face neutral, but inside her mind was already 3 steps ahead. She had 2 choices: refuse, which could justify him escalating further; comply, putting herself at his mercy. Neither was ideal. She needed a third option, one that kept her in control. Her fingers flexed subtly against the steering wheel, her pulse steady, her breathing measured. "Then let's call your superior and see if he gives a damn." She saw it immediately, the way his body tensed, the way his smirk faltered just for a second. The flashlight remained steady, but his jaw clenched. "Lady, I don't give a damn who you work for." His voice had changed. Lower, tighter, like he was losing his grip on something invisible. Camille knew that tone. She had heard it in interrogation rooms, in high-stakes negotiations, in dangerous standoffs where men felt their power slipping. Reynolds wanted her to be afraid, but fear, that wasn't something Camille Dawson allowed herself to feel. She had survived too much for that. But this was no longer just a traffic stop. This was something else entirely. And Camille wasn't about to go down without a fight. The silence between Camille and Reynolds stretched, thick and suffocating. She could see it in his posture, in the way his hand hovered near his gun, the way his chest rose and fell just a little too fast. He wasn't just a cop doing his job. He was a man itching for control. And that was dangerous. Camille held his gaze, her hand still resting firmly on the steering wheel, her breath slow and steady. "I asked you a question, officer. On what grounds am I being detained?" Reynolds didn't answer. Instead, he chewed his gum slowly, eyes narrowing as if he was daring her to push further. Then, another set of headlights appeared in her side mirror. Her stomach clenched. A second patrol car. This was about to get worse. The new patrol car rolled to a stop behind Reynolds' unit, its bright headlights spilling over the road. Camille kept her expression unreadable, but her mind was already analyzing the situation. Best-case scenario. This officer was just passing by and would ensure protocol was followed. Worst-case scenario. He was just another bad cop backing his own. The second officer stepped out, adjusting his duty belt as he approached. Officer Tyler Briggs. Camille could tell immediately this wasn't backup. This was reinforcement. Briggs wasn't here to de-escalate. He was here to make sure Reynolds got what he wanted. His steps were casual but deliberate, his eyes briefly flicking to Reynolds before settling on Camille. Reynolds didn't even look at him. That told her everything she needed to know. They had done this before. They had a system. And now she was in it. Briggs didn't speak. Instead, he shifted his stance, stepping slightly to the side, positioning himself strategically. Camille's breath slowed. He was blocking her dash cam. Her fingers curled against the leather of the steering wheel, calculated, deliberate, intentional. She had sat through briefings about cases like this. Officers manipulating angles, blocking cameras, controlling the narrative before anything even happened. She knew what came next. Reynolds moved first. In a swift, sudden motion, he lunged forward and grabbed Camille's wrist, yanking her arm toward the open car door. Her breath hitched, not in fear but in controlled reaction. Too fast, too aggressive. This wasn't an attempt to detain her. This was a test, a provocation. She could feel his fingers digging into her skin, the rough texture of his callous palm, the unnecessary force behind the grip. It wasn't just about getting her out of the car. It was about showing her that he could. "You think you have authority here," he sneered, his face close enough that she could smell the stale gum on his breath. Camille didn't flinch. She didn't pull back violently, that was what he wanted. She didn't yell or curse, that would feed into the narrative he was trying to create. Instead, she held perfectly still, her jaw tightening just enough to send a different message. I see you. I know what you're doing, and you're not going to break me. Take your hand off me. Her voice was calm but edged with steel. Reynolds didn't let go immediately, but she saw the hesitation in his stance, the slightest flicker of uncertainty. That was her opening. Before Reynolds could double down, Camille shifted her focus to Briggs, making direct eye contact with him. If there was any conscience in him, this was his moment to step in. Officer Briggs, I am the director of the FBI. Her voice remained measured but unyielding. You are witnessing an illegal use of force. Are you going to intervene or are you complicit? The word complicit landed like a gunshot. For the first time, Briggs hesitated. Reynolds noticed it too. His grip on her wrist tightened, but only for a fraction of a second, a split moment of frustration. Then he let go. He hadn't expected that play. She had shifted the pressure onto Briggs. And now Reynolds was watching his partner, waiting for him to act. Briggs didn't move. He didn't step back, but he also didn't step forward. That was enough for Camille to know he wasn't sure how far this should go. She had planted a seed, a hesitation. That hesitation was her leverage, and she wasn't about to waste it. Let's be clear about something, Officer Reynolds, she said, her voice lower now, deliberate, steady. You can threaten me. You can try to intimidate me, but if you escalate this any further, you better be damn sure you're ready for the consequences. Reynolds' smirk faltered just slightly. She had flipped the script. She wasn't pleading for fairness. She was warning them what would happen if they crossed the line. Briggs shifted on his feet, his jaw tightening. For a moment the air stood still, and then Reynolds snorted, shaking his head. He wasn't backing down, but he was rethinking his approach. Camille knew it wasn't over, not yet, not even close, but she had bought herself time. And right now, that was everything. The tension was suffocating. Camille could feel it pressing against her chest, thick and heavy like a noose tightening around the situation. Every instinct she had honed over the years screamed caution, but she refused to let fear dictate her next move. Reynolds wasn't just testing her authority anymore. He was challenging it outright. She had seen men like him before, officers who mistook their badge for a crown, who wielded their authority like a weapon rather than a duty. And she knew how dangerous they could be. Camille kept her hands firmly visible, resisting the instinct to rub the sore spot on her wrist where Reynolds had yanked her moments ago. This isn't going to end the way you think, officer, she said, keeping her tone even, unwavering. I know the law. Do you? Briggs shifted beside them, his silence louder than anything else. For a split second, she almost thought this was working, almost thought Reynolds was going to think twice before taking things further. But she was wrong, because Reynolds had already made up his mind. It happened fast. One moment, Reynolds was just standing there, tension crackling in the space between them. The next, his hand flew to his holster, the snap of leather, the glint of steel, and then the barrel of a gun aimed straight at Camille's face. A slow, icy chill spread down her spine, but Camille didn't move, didn't flinch. Didn't give him what he wanted. She had stared down criminals before, men who had everything to lose, who were backed into corners, who saw pulling the trigger as their only way out. This was different. Reynolds wasn't acting out of fear or desperation. He was acting out of arrogance. That made him more dangerous. Her training screamed at her to move, to act, to react. But she knew the rules of this game. If she moved wrong, she'd be the one on the ground. And he'd be the one writing the report about how she resisted. Camille flicked her gaze toward Briggs, searching for a sign, any sign, that he wasn't going to let this happen, but he just stood there, watching, silent, complicit. And that's when it hit her this wasn't new for them. This wasn't an accident. They had done this before. Maybe not to someone like her, maybe not to an FBI director, but to someone who didn't have the power to fight back. And that realization lit something in her chest, something hotter than fear, something stronger. Just as Reynolds' finger twitched on the gun, the night air was shattered by a voice. "Hey, I'm recording this." It came from across the road, sharp and commanding. Reynolds' entire body stiffened. Camille could see it, the fraction of a second where his stance wavered, the tiny hesitation that hadn't been there before. For the first time tonight, he wasn't in control anymore. Across the highway, just beyond the glow of the streetlights, a man stood near the shoulder of the road. A truck driver, by the looks of it. His phone was raised, the screen glowing in the dark like an unblinking eye. Recording, capturing everything. The exact moment Reynolds pulled his gun, the exact way Briggs did nothing, the exact power dynamic that had just shifted. Camille didn't need to see Reynolds' face to know what he was thinking. She already knew. She had seen it in interrogation rooms, in courtrooms, in back offices where powerful men were suddenly confronted with the weight of their own consequences. He was calculating now, trying to find a way out, because this was on video, and a cop like Reynolds, he didn't fear internal affairs, he didn't fear complaints, but he feared public outrage, feared a video going viral, feared a camera more than he feared accountability. Camille finally let herself move just an inch, just enough to tilt her chin up. "You sure you want to do this, officer?" she asked, voice calm but cutting. Reynolds' jaw clenched, his knuckles white around the grip of his gun. He was stuck. If he backed down, it meant admitting he was wrong. If he didn't, the sirens in the distance grew louder. Camille's pulse remained steady. Time to make a choice, Reynolds, because one way or another, this was ending tonight. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the thick tension hanging over the deserted highway. The sound was like a drumbeat, a countdown to the moment everything changed. Reynolds heard it too. Camille watched as his jaw clenched, his grip on the gun still tight. But now there was something else in his stance, hesitation. He knew. His game was over. The same law he had twisted in his favor for so long was finally working against him. For the first time tonight, Camille allowed herself a slow breath. She had survived the worst of it. Now, it was his turn to feel the fear. Bright headlights flooded the scene, throwing long shadows across the pavement. 2 new squad cars pulled up, sirens cutting off abruptly. Doors flew open. And then Lieutenant Jason Cole stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the calm, measured presence of someone who actually understood authority. Unlike Reynolds, his uniform was pristine, his posture controlled, not aggressive. Camille saw the moment recognition flashed across his face, his brows furrowed, then his mouth parted slightly in shock. "Director Dawson." The title hit the air like a gunshot. Briggs stiffened. "Reynolds." He went rigid, his entire body locking up as if someone had turned him to stone. Camille lowered her hand slowly, making it clear she wasn't the one who needed to be controlled here. Her voice, when she spoke, was cold, unwavering. "I want them both in handcuffs. Now." The weight of her words hung between them. For a split second, no one moved. Then Cole's eyes snapped to Reynolds, then Briggs. He saw the gun still in Reynolds' hands. He saw Camille, calm but unshaken, standing in the same place she had been all along, while the 2 officers looked like they had just seen a ghost. It took Cole exactly 2 seconds to make his decision. He didn't hesitate. "Officer Reynolds, Officer Briggs, hands where I can see them. Now." Briggs reacted first, his head dipping just slightly, like a man who knew this was coming. He didn't resist, didn't argue. He simply raised his hands slowly, his shoulders dropping in resignation, because he had bet on the wrong side tonight. But Reynolds fought back. "You have got to be kidding me," Reynolds snapped, his voice raw with disbelief. His face twisted, eyes darting wildly between Camille, Briggs, and Cole, as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. She was resisting. She wasn't complying. Reynolds tried, desperation creeping into his voice. She pulled rank. Cole's expression remained impassive. You pulled a gun on the director of the FBI, Reynolds. His voice was even firm. Let me know if you'd like to add resisting arrest to the list. The words hit like a punch to the gut. For a man like Reynolds, someone who had likely spent his entire career getting away with things just like this, the realization was crushing. He wasn't the one calling the shots anymore, and he never would be again. Cole stepped forward, and before Reynolds could protest further, a second officer grabbed his wrist, twisting it behind his back. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed through the night. Reynolds' breath hitched. Camille could hear it, the sound of a man who had always been untouchable finally feeling the weight of accountability. Briggs didn't resist as an officer cuffed him as well. He simply stared at the ground, avoiding Camille's gaze. Camille didn't look away. She wanted him to know, she wanted them both to know, this wasn't just about tonight. This was about all the nights before this one, all the traffic stops that had ended with someone like her lying on the pavement instead of standing tall. But tonight, the system had turned against them instead of for them. Reynolds was still fuming, but he knew there was nothing left to say, nothing left to argue. The only thing waiting for him now was a cold jail cell and a career in ruins. Camille finally exhaled, letting the last remnants of tension leave her body. She turned to Cole, voice steady. Get them out of my sight. Cole gave a sharp nod. With pleasure, Director. And just like that, it was over. The night had been long, but Camille Dawson wasn't tired. Not yet. She stood by the window of her office, looking out over the Houston skyline, her phone buzzing incessantly on her desk. The city pulsed with life below her, streetlights casting golden veins across the pavement, headlights streaking through the streets. But tonight, something was different. She could feel it. Something had shifted, and the world had seen it happen. By the time Camille had reached her office, the video footage of the traffic stop had already begun spreading like wildfire. A civilian recording. 2 armed officers abusing their power. And a single black woman standing her ground. It was everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, major news networks. It was impossible to ignore. One of the most shared clips had an all too familiar caption. This could have ended differently. By morning, it had racked up over 10 million views. By noon, the Department of Justice had officially announced a full investigation. By the end of the day, the Houston Police Department was in full damage control mode. And by midnight, Officer Luke Reynolds was officially fired, booked, and charged with assault with a deadly weapon. For once, the system was moving fast. Too fast for the Houston PD to control. The indictment came swiftly, faster than even Camille had expected. The public pressure was relentless, pushing the DOJ to act immediately. The charges against Reynolds: severe, assault with a deadly weapon, unlawful use of force, reckless endangerment, abuse of power, and Briggs. While he hadn't drawn his gun, his silence had been just as damning. He was suspended indefinitely, pending an internal review. Camille had no doubt what the conclusion would be. Complicity had consequences now. For the first time in his career, Briggs learned that standing by and doing nothing was just as bad as pulling the trigger. But the truth was, they weren't the only 2 officers like this. They were just the ones who got caught. By the next afternoon, the Houston Police Department released an official statement, one of those carefully worded, PR-controlled speeches designed to contain the damage. Camille sat in her office watching the live broadcast, her arms crossed. The Houston Police Department does not tolerate misconduct within its ranks. We take these allegations seriously and are committed to transparency. Officer Reynolds has been terminated effective immediately, and Officer Briggs is under administrative review. We are working closely with the Department of Justice to ensure accountability. Camille let out a slow exhale, neatly packaged. Too polished, too perfectly rehearsed. They weren't sorry it happened. They were sorry it had been caught on camera. They were scrambling, trying to get ahead of the outrage. But Camille wasn't naive. She knew real justice wasn't a press release. It wasn't a convenient statement to appease the public. It was action. And she had no intention of letting this fade into another forgotten headline. She didn't stop at just one investigation. She dug deeper. By the end of the day, she had 3 reports on her desk, all related to complaints filed against Reynolds in the past 5 years: excessive force, racial profiling, unlawful stops. Each case had been buried, swept under the rug, dismissed due to lack of evidence. How many times had this happened before? How many victims had been ignored? Camille had seen too many cases like this. Too many names in cold reports, too many families left without answers. But not this time. This time she was going to make sure it stuck. She made one phone call to the Department of Justice, then another, then another. By the end of the night, she had done more than ensure Reynolds never wore a badge again. She had put the entire Houston PD under review. That night, as Camille sat at her desk reviewing the reports, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She hesitated before opening the message. "I respect what you did. Most people wouldn't stand up to them." She didn't need to ask who it was. The witness. The truck driver who had spoken up, who had pulled out his phone when it mattered. For a long moment, she just stared at the message, letting the weight of it settle over her. Then she typed back, "Justice doesn't happen in silence. We can't afford to look away." She hit send. And somehow, in the quiet of her office, she let herself feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief, not peace, but resolve. Because this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Camille knew this wasn't the end. This was just one battle in a much bigger war. One case where accountability actually happened. But what about the others? The ones that didn't go viral? The ones where no one was there to record? The ones where people didn't live to tell their side of the story? She thought about the victims she had read about over the years. The families that had fought for justice and lost. The officers who had walked away, their careers untouched. She wasn't going to let this die down. She wasn't going to let this be another moment that people forgot. She turned her gaze back toward the city, watching the lights blink against the dark. The fight against systemic abuse was far from over, and she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The events that unfolded on that dark Texas highway were more than just a single case of misconduct. They were a reflection of a system that had long protected those who abused their power, until, for once, the system turned against them instead of for them. Camille Dawson's encounter with officers Reynolds and Briggs was not an isolated incident. It was a glimpse into a much larger issue, one that has existed for decades, one that has claimed countless lives, and one that only comes to light when people refuse to look away. This story teaches several key lessons, ones that apply not just to law enforcement, but to society as a whole. 1. Silence enables injustice. One of the most chilling aspects of this situation was Briggs' silence. He wasn't the one pulling the gun. He wasn't the one making threats, but he let it happen. His inaction was just as dangerous as Reynolds' aggression. This is true in so many areas of life. Whether it's police brutality, workplace discrimination, or any form of abuse, the silence of bystanders enables oppressors. When good people stand by and do nothing, they are complicit in the harm being done. This is why speaking up matters. The moment we refuse to ignore injustice, we become part of the solution rather than part of the problem. 2. The power of a camera. One of the most powerful moments in this story came when a random truck driver pulled over and started recording. In that moment, Reynolds realized he was being watched, and it changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Technology has given people a tool to demand accountability in real time. In previous decades, these incidents would have been brushed under the rug, dismissed as, he said, She said cases where law enforcement always had the final word. But today, with cell phones and social media, the world has a front row seat to reality. The lesson here: never underestimate the power of bearing witness. If you see something wrong happening, record it, document it, speak out. It can mean the difference between justice and another forgotten tragedy. 3. Justice requires action, not just awareness. It wasn't enough that the public saw what happened to Camille. It wasn't enough that people were outraged. Real change only came because action was taken. The Department of Justice launched an investigation. Reynolds was fired and arrested. Briggs was suspended indefinitely. The Houston PD was forced to respond. This shows that awareness alone is not enough. It has to be followed by action. Public pressure forces institutions to be accountable, but it takes leaders like Camille to make sure those responsible are held to the highest standards. 4. The fight isn't over for every case like this that gets justice. There are countless others that don't. The reality is, Camille's story could have ended very differently if not for her position, her knowledge of the law, and the presence of a witness. This raises an important question. What happens when there is no witness? What happens when the victim isn't someone powerful? That's why the fight against systemic abuse must continue. Every voice matters. Every case that is exposed chips away at a corrupt foundation. Every demand for reform brings change one step closer. Justice doesn't happen in silence, and we can't afford to look away.